Roger, liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir, reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, Roger, go from them.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the July 31st, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Michael Abdullah from the Space Association of Australia, and I'm joined by Tina Stagg this week. It's just the two of us tonight, like Sandra Bullock and George Clooney in Gravity, except with far less chit-chat during EVAs. So let's get started with some Aussie space news. Gilmour Space Technologies was due to launch its One Vision rocket near Mount Isa on Sunday. The outcome of the attempt, using a mobile launch pad, had not been made public at the time of recording this week's space news. The Gold Coast-based rocket engineering company completed the final stages of the rocket's testing amid celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. The 8.6-metre, 1,600 kilogram One Vision suborbital launch vehicle is designed to deliver satellite payloads into space. Sunday's launch was to be the official trial run before Gilmour Space commercialises its services in 2020. And moving to New Zealand and our friends at Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab says it has now produced 100 of its Rutherford engines as it prepares for its next Electron launch. The company said it reached the production milestone recently, crediting a design that makes extensive use of 3D printing technologies to enable it to ramp up production. Each Electron rocket uses 9 Rutherford engines in its first stage and 1 in its second stage. The next Electron launch is scheduled for early August, carrying a black sky imaging satellite and several small-sat secondary payloads. And over to you, Tina.
Thanks, Michael, and good evening, space fans. Looking at US space policy news, a key House appropriator said last week he is concerned about the cost of speeding up NASA's plans to return humans to the moon. At a hearing about the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Representative Jose Serrano, a Democrat from New York, who's chairman of the Commerce, Justice and Science Appropriations Subcommittee, said the additional funds needed to land humans on the moon by 2024 versus earlier plans for a 2028 return could have grave consequences for other programs. Serrano added that he wasn't opposed to sending astronauts to the moon, only that he disagreed with spending this money on moving something up a couple of years. The House has already passed an appropriations bill that funds NASA, but without the $1.6 billion in additional Artemis funding requested. That bill will have to be reconciled with the Senate version not yet introduced. To NASA and the Commercial Crew Program, a Japanese astronaut is the first non-NASA astronaut assigned to a commercial crew mission. The Japanese space agency JAXA said that Soichi Noguchi will go to the ISS on a future commercial crew vehicle, although the specific mission and date have yet to be announced. While NASA has assigned astronauts to the first operational commercial crew missions by Boeing and SpaceX, it had not yet identified what astronauts from ISS partners would also fly on those missions. To the SLS and Orion program, NASA announced on Thursday it will proceed with a green run test of the SLS 4 months after the agency's leader suggested it could be skipped. NASA said the so-called full-duration green run test of the SLS core stage will take place as planned next year at the Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. In March, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said NASA was considering skipping the test in order to accelerate the schedule for the rocket's first launch. Some members of Congress, as well as outside advisors, opposed that plan because of safety concerns. And to the Artemis program, NASA plans to issue a sole source contract to Northrop Grumman for building a habitation model for the Lunar Gateway. In a recent procurement filing, Northrop's concept for a minimal habitation module is based on its Cygnus cargo spacecraft, which NASA said was a key factor in selecting the company. NASA and Northrop will now negotiate a contract for the module, the value of which the agency did not disclose. NASA and the White House used the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 to mark a milestone in its plans to return to the moon. In a speech at the Kennedy Space Center, Vice President Mike Pence said that the Orion spacecraft being built for the Artemis 1 mission was now complete, meaning its crew module and service module were now integrated. The combined spacecraft will undergo testing in the coming months before being prepared for a launch, likely in 2021. Pence also used the event to reaffirm the administration's plans to return humans to the surface of the moon by 2024. Only the day before, President Trump appeared to reopen the possibility of skipping the moon and accelerating human missions to Mars in an Oval Office media opportunity that featured Apollo 11 astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. NASA has disclosed new details about how it plans to acquire lunar landers to achieve the 2020 deadline. In a pre-solicitation notice recently, NASA said it will seek proposals for landers that initially will be able to take 2 astronauts to the surface for a 6.5-day stay in 2024. Those landers will be upgraded as soon as 2026, enabling larger crews and longer stays on the lunar surface. NASA plans to acquire lunar landing services rather than the landers themselves through public-private partnerships where companies will be required to contribute at least 10% of the costs of developing the landers. Back to Mike.
Thanks, Tina. And let's have a look at the US Air Force. The US Air Force says its recently launched DSX satellite is the largest structure in space other than the International Space Station. The DSX, or Demonstration and Science Experiments Satellite, was launched on the Falcon Heavy STP-2 mission last month. The satellite deployed antenna booms spanning 80 metres on July 12. The Air Force Research Laboratory says the satellite will be used to study the Van Allen radiation belts and their effects on spacecraft components. Moving to China. A Chinese startup became the first private company in the country to place a payload into orbit late last week. The Hyperbola 1 rocket from iSpace lifted off from the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center. The company reported the small, solid-fueled rocket successfully placed several small satellites into orbit, making iSpace the first private Chinese company to reach orbit. 2 other companies, Landspace and OneSpace, attempted orbital launches during the last year, but all suffered failures. Let's look at Pakistan. The government of Pakistan says it will send a person into space by 2022. Chaudhry Fawad Hussain, Minister of Science and Technology in the Pakistani government, said the country will start selecting candidates for the flight next year. However, he didn't say how Pakistan will launch that astronaut. The comments appear to be in response to plans by India, announced last year, to launch its first crewed spacecraft by 2022. And back to you, Tina.
Thanks, Mike. India's Chandrayaan-2 lunar mission has completed its first post-launch manoeuvre. The Indian Space Agency ISRO said the manoeuvre early last week raised the perigee of its elliptical transfer orbit from 170 to 230 kilometres. A second orbit-raising manoeuvre took place later in the week. Chandrayaan-2 will gradually raise its orbit around the Earth until it reaches the Moon in mid-August. ISRO is delaying the first launch of a new small launch vehicle until after the Chandrayaan-2 landing. ISRO previously said it would perform the first test launch of the Small Satellite Launch Vehicle, or SSLV, in June or July, But ISRO Chairman Kay Sivan said the launch will be postponed until after the attempted landing, probably in September. SSLV is designed to place 500 kilograms into low Earth orbit for about 1/10 of the cost of the existing larger PSLV rocket. India may cooperate with Japan on a future lunar sample return mission. The two nations' space agencies have reportedly held initial discussions about cooperation on a potential Chandrayaan-3 mission in the early 2020s. That mission would go to the moon, collect samples and return them to Earth, although there is yet no formal agreement or confirmation that discussions are taking place. The reports about the discussions came the day after the successful launch of Chandrayaan-2. And turning to commercial news and SpaceX. SpaceX successfully launched a Dragon cargo spacecraft to the International Space Station last week. The Falcon 9 lifted off from Cape Canaveral after a one-day delay because of weather, with the first stage making a successful landing back at the Cape. The CRS-18 Dragon spacecraft arrived at the ISS over the weekend, bringing more than 2,300 kilograms of supplies and equipment for the station. This is the first Dragon spacecraft to make a third flight into space, having previously flown cargo missions to the station in 2015 and 2017. Meanwhile, SpaceX's Starhopper prototype made its first, if brief, free flight later that same evening. The vehicle lifted off its pad at the company's South Texas test site at about 11:45 p.m. US Eastern Time and rose a short distance off the ground before touching down about 10 seconds later. The vehicle was largely obscured by the plume from its Raptor engine during the free flight. Starhopper, our first prototype of SpaceX's Starship Next Generation launch system, may fly to an altitude of 200 metres in a week or two, SpaceX CEO Elon Musk tweeted after the test. Michael.
Thanks, Tina. Let's move to Blue Origin. Blue Origin still has a few more New Shepard test flights to perform before the company starts flying people on the suborbital spacecraft. Bob Smith, the CEO of Blue Origin, said the company still hopes to perform a first flight of the vehicle with people on board before the end of this year. The vehicle performed its last test flight more than 2.5 months ago, and the company hasn't announced when the next flight will take place. And back to you, Tina.
The Planetary Society's LightSail 2 spacecraft appears to have successfully deployed its solar sail. Telemetry from the spacecraft is consistent with the successful deployment of the 32 square metre sail, project officials said last week, although they weren't able to immediately get images back from the spacecraft confirming that was the case. LightSail 2 launched as part of the Falcon Heavy STP-2 mission last month and was released from another satellite early this month. The spacecraft's mission is to demonstrate the ability of solar sails to propel a spacecraft and change its orbit. And finally, back to Michael.
Thank you, Tina. Auctions of Apollo 11 items have brought in several $1 million. An auction by Sotheby's included a set of videotapes of the landing that went for $1.82 million, despite NASA debunking claims these contained lost video of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. A separate auction by Heritage Auctions included a gold medallion flown to the moon and back by Armstrong that sold for $2.055 million. However, a flight plan flown on the Apollo 11 lunar lander failed to attract a single bid at Christie's auction, despite estimates it would sell for between $7 to $9 million. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you very much, Tina, and it's back to you, Andrew.